All right, let's get started. Aicha, if you don't mind, we'll do our little preamble work here. You know how to use Zoom. Make sure if you're doing chat, I don't know if some of you are doing this, mine defaults to host and panelist, but just click over to everyone so that we all see that and double check if you sent something. Hey, Jerry. And then you can ask Q&A, you ask questions in the chat. We're gonna have like the last 15 minutes or so. We'll do some open-ended Q&A for you all. Our panelists today, welcome. We're in conversation with Steve Duncombe, Professor of Media and Culture at NYU, Jane McGonigal, Director of Game Research and Development at IFTF. Jane, that doesn't do enough credit to all the things that you're doing there, but we have to keep it limited, I guess. And Clara Romo as a program officer at the Open Government Partnership. She's based in Mexico City. Jane's in the Bay Area, Steve's in New York, if you didn't see that earlier. Hey, Christy, good to see you. So we're gonna have a conversation today. I'm gonna introduce our guests. We're gonna meet them. We're gonna reflect back on the Reconstitutional Convention, which I'll talk about in a minute, that we ran 10 years ago at IFTF and elsewhere. We'll talk about a little bit of, like I said, reminiscence of that, the impact of that, the last 10 years, a short stock take of that, things that we're working on now, and then really think about what social invention and political system design and constitution design might mean for going forward in the future. And at the end, like I said, we'll have some Q&A. IFTF, we've been around 55 years or so at this point. We're around to try to help organizations, people, our society become future ready. Maybe, as I like to say, not always learn the hard way. Maybe we'll get ahead of some things that I'm not very confident that we can do that, but we'll try. We'll try to get ahead of some of the challenges and maybe not learn the hard way like we often do, or blindsided. We do trainings, we do, yeah, you can go on. We do research, we do talks, we do consulting kind of work, we do design and experiences, all kinds of different ways to help us interface with the future and help people see it and act appropriately on change and understand what's going on. Our training, we have sort of different tracks here for individuals. You can take our flagship course, Foresight Essentials. We have a Design Futures, which is really oriented around the experience of the future and creating artifacts. If you're really into wanting to know how to think about and write scenarios and build those, we have a course for that that's coming up as well. Jane's curated course that she designed on Coursera is a wonderful, great place to start for introducing futures. And then we also have custom trainings for organizations. We do what we call future back accelerators as well. And then we have other specific courses, our COVID course, for example. So we do some topical courses as well. Upcoming, we have our AI course, 3 Horizons of AI. If you're trying to make sense of what's going on there, it's a great course. Again, our scenario building is starting very soon. Foresight training, we have online coming up. We have one in Palo Alto and then in Auckland, New Zealand next year. So those of you who are joining us at wee hours of the morning right now or listening to the recording, check that one out. And then our Design Futures training online coming up at the end of November and December. And then we have resources. We'll just go through this. We have webinars, we have newsletters, we have meetups, our social posts, and then want to do a shout out to the Urgent Optimist community as well. It's a wonderful community. Jane, again, has started and curates that. So a great place to go to build a network and knowledge around futures with a wonderful and welcoming group. Okay, so we have our Vantage program as well. So look into that. You can look in that and ask questions, and we can get back to you if you have if you want to know more about our kind of flagship membership program that we have here at the Institute. All right, yeah, we're getting some shout outs for Urgent Optimists in the chat. Okay, I've given you just the name and title. I'm gonna let each of our guests introduce themselves just a little bit more, then we'll go into the questions, and then I'll talk about the Reconstitutional Convention, the idea of social invention, where we sit. Well, actually, you know what, let me pull back. I'm going to do a little bit of ReconCon setup, and then our guests can kind of fold that into their introductions as well. All right, so the Reconstitutional Convention, this was an event we ran 10 years ago, and this is kind of the occasion, a 10-year anniversary, as it were, of that event. We ran it in Palo Alto and 9 different satellite places around the world simultaneously. The course or the event itself was built around a toolkit. So you can also Google our social inventors toolkit. So it's a step-by-step process for reinventing government, not too ambitious of a task, but we have to start somewhere. And we actually start with a great foundation, which was built on Jim Dator, one of the godfathers of future studies. He had a regularly occurring class called Political System Design at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where I went and studied with Jim. And so in a sense, we kind of took the course process, the syllabus from that class, and turned it into a step-by-step modular kind of system for doing political system design. Again, maybe there are many other ways to do it. Maybe this is not the best, but I find it a really robust and interesting and useful framework for thinking systematically and doing things that are a little bit more upstream. We can get into some of those as well, but more than just like how do we improve voting? Maybe that's part of it, but it's really thinking about what is human nature? Who are we as political subjects? What do we think about reality? So you get really deep before you even begin the design process in that. So that was the basis. We kind of wanted to test and get people together, and we got, you see this wild and wonderful group we have here, just a small sample of the types of folks we had there, excellent people. Yes, con law people and political scientists. Yes, elected officials and bureaucrats, but also game designers and media theorists and, people working in the civic sector from all over the world. So it was a different kind of vibe than you might see at a maybe, sort of more traditional political design or constitutional design process. And that worked really well, I think. So that was a setting 10 years ago. And I brought back our guest here to think about, kind of where you were in 2013. Introduce yourself, of course, but as you're doing that, think about where your head was, your mind and body in 2013. And I went back and looked at just some of the news that was happening. I mean, I didn't have to look up things that were on our minds at the time, like, still in the kind of, I don't know what you would call it, the kind of wake of the Arab Spring, and Occupy was still on people's minds. Obama had just just started his second term at the time. The Syrian conflict was raging. I did look up this and I had forgotten there was, a kind of a bird flu outbreak happening in China, which would be like, no big deal. Millions of birds and fowl were killed to try to eradicate that. So even back then, these little weak signals of pandemic, a possible global pandemic were always present on our minds as well. And then, this was one also that I, when I read it, I was like, oh yeah. So there was a Twitter hoax that Obama had been injured in an explosion that had happened like a few days before our event. And there was a stock market crash, flash crash that happened at the time. So, Twitter was a big player back then for sure, and being, manipulated in different ways, and probably led to them trying to weed out disinformation until recently. So that has changed. So anyway, all of those things are kind of very interesting and resonant for us today to think about 10 years ago. This was pre-Trump, this was pre-COVID, all these things that have happened in between. Okay, so enough of that scene setting. I would like to start, maybe Clora, you can kick us off, give us a little bit more about yourself, and then also just, mentally time travel back to that time and where you were and kind of what was on your mind at the time. What were you thinking about yourself and politics and the future?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me. And also it is great to reconvene with all of you. And well, definitely 10 years ago. So, okay, for introducing myself, and I'm an architect based in Mexico City who is very enthusiastic about civic participation and how to further that in order to make more impactful, let's say, reforms and initiatives that can better or create a better life in the cities. So I remember distinctively that I was younger, definitely younger, maybe more naive, yes, but I was always a believer, right? It was my first experience thinking collaboratively there in the ReconCon about the future. It was my first time like really trying to grasp a little bit of how we can envision the things that we wanted the world to become, right? At that time, I was stepping into a new governmental area called Laboratory for the City, or Laboratorio para la Ciudad, which was a Mexican experimental arm for the city government that was focused on developing new approaches to how citizens could actively participate in creating policies under diverse themes. So in that specific moment, I think it was it's a brew of inspiration. Like I remember being amazed in how all the participants in this ReconCon were envisioning the future of governance, and I remember also being part of a group that proposed a specific framework that was the power of imagination. And I remember that that was like a mantra for ourselves. When I was with my then co-founder Gabriela Gomez Mont, thinking about how we can further a civic innovation kind of laboratory for the city, and how imagination should be a fundamental part of the creativity that we needed to have around in the creation of new public policies and everything. And I was amazed by how this concept of the power of imagination can become a tool for furthering democracy. And this example, I think, gave me a glimpse of hope about how our hopes and dreams might become a way to share new ideas and bring them to life. And I think that was my first. I think that, yeah, the takeaway that I got from this first experience of collaborating and thinking collaboratively about the future.
Well, the Lab for the City is almost legendary at this point. I mean, it was so exciting to know that it existed in 2013, and it was so innovative. You know, everyone was very excited to watch what it was going to do with heightened anticipation. So maybe we can get into some of those things along the way in its life journey, and all of the little ripples that happen from that. Yeah, I mean, I think this theme is going to come up a lot is imagination. And, you know, I mean, maybe that was on people's minds at the time, but it felt, and I think it still does, felt very fresh, that is not just kind of a throwaway line, but to build systems. What would infrastructures for imagination look like within bureaucracy, within government, within, you know, kind of the civic sector, and in, you know, and broadly in our society. So yeah, flagging that theme, you know, I think it was noteworthy then, and it still is, to see how that's developed over time. Dr. Stephen Duncombe is in New York. Somehow you're 10 years younger than you were back then. I don't know how you time travel, but anyway, welcome.
I love your flattery, Jake. And I remember being in Clora's group and having that great discussion about the power of imagination. And when this invitation came in, and thank you, by the way, it is wonderful to be back here and see familiar faces. I thought, you know, well, what was I thinking at that time? And I was working a lot on utopia, in both theory and practice. In addition to my life as a university professor, the other thing I do is I co-created a group called the Center for Artistic Activism, where we train activists around the world. We train them to be more creative, to use more artistic techniques, and very importantly, to use their imagination and imagine the world they want to bring into being, as opposed to just the world that they want to stop or protest against. So I imagined that I was super, super optimistic walking in. And then I looked back at my slide deck, and this was my first slide.
Yes.
And I said, well, maybe I wasn't so optimistic. But then I remembered that actually I looked down a little bit more at what I was talking about, is that in some ways, that came out of Occupy Wall Street. That was the year of the Arab Spring, the events in around May 15th in Spain, and this kind of upsurge of both disenchantment with the government, shit is fucked up and bullshit, and also sort of inchoate idea of what was actually wrong and what was to be done, which in some ways was very frustrating, but it was also very freeing. Because in a lot of ways, that not knowing opened up a space for us to imagine different ways of doing things. And you could see that actually happening on the ground all over the place. So now 10 years later, you know, shit is still fucked up and bullshit. And I'm afraid I'm a little bit less optimistic. Maybe it's just because I'm a little bit older and less naive, but it's also because we live in very different times. I mean, I think you did a great job of sort of what was the world that snapshot of what the world we were in. But, you know, it was pre Donald Trump. You did see the rise of right-wing populism in other parts of the world, but it hadn't come to the United States. It was pre-COVID, and it was pre-massive disinformation. And I think part of the problem is that shit still is fucked up and bullshit, but people have settled on what the problem is and what the solutions are. And the problem is always them, right? And part of them is government. And the solutions are to shut down, to block off, to bully, to troll, to not really engage productively, but engage destructively. And so I think we're facing the same world, but it's actually progressed, or should we say degressed, or at least bigressed in the past 10 years. And so I'm ready for some optimism.
Good. Well, I'm about to pass to Jane, which I think will help. But just thinking about, you know, what you're saying there, and I think we recognized Trump-like dynamics. I think we had conversations saying, you know, it's really not about the people, it's about the structure. And so we went into that room and the mindset of thinking about ourselves as architects and designers and structural engineers in a way, which I think was a better path than what happened is got very ad hominem and human and us and them. And, you know, I think so in a sense, sort of taking a step back, not bloodless, but taking a step back and looking at the system structurally and where the failures are. Boy, it would have been nice had we had that frame of analysis to solve our problems rather than, as you say, demagoguery and xenophobia and us and them, which we're all seeing the sacrifices the innocent people are paying for that point of view, winning out. Okay, sorry, Jane. Yeah, I don't want to always throw like you have to be the sort of optimistic savior of us all, but I think you're naturally in that space and attuned to that. So thank you for existing. Dr. Jane McGonigal, where are you? Where's your head? And where might it have been 10 years ago?
Yeah, I think I know so many of the folks who've joined us today. If I haven't met you, I direct the Urgent Optimist public membership program for Institute for the Future, where we do things like monthly scenario club and we play social simulations. Next year, we will be, in fact, reinventing government in our social simulations. So this is a really timely topic for us. You know, when I think about 10 years ago, why were there game designers at our ReconCon event? You know, there was a sense back then that virtual worlds and virtual economies were like a staging ground where you could test different forms of governance and representation and decision making and economic intervention. Even public health interventions were being tested by the CDC, right? In virtual worlds. And so there was a lot of optimism. Maybe we could kind of simulate or experiment in these virtual worlds. I don't think that has actually happened in the subsequent decade. When I think about the sort of relationship between our incredible gaming culture and government today, you know, I feel like there's still an opportunity to take the mindset of game design or virtual world governance, which is very much that things are changeable, and that you can experiment and you can try a different rule set or a different incentive and see what happens, but there's not this sort of enshrinement of ways to play or ways to govern. And Jake, you and I were talking about an interesting op-ed in the Washington Post that was published yesterday, where they were comparing the fact that the US Constitution has only been amended 27 times in hundreds of years. The Norwegian Constitution has 316 amendments, which to me is like so inspiring. Like if I were to give a mandate to everyone at this convening right now, it would be like, what 316 changes would you make to your constitution where, you know, that you are governed by? Because what a beautiful number, like 316 ways government could be different. That sense of like playfulness and freedom to change and freedom to experiment and openness. So when I'm thinking about, back then we thought we just kind of simulate changes, come up with the best changes, and then enact them in the real world. But I think really we just need to bring to the real world that sense of playfulness, reinventability, so that we can try new things because we're so stuck in old ways of doing things.
Yeah, so much to unpack there for all of us. Yeah, even that's a big chunk of what I lead with as well. It's just the social inventors framing and identity. It said the world was invented, it was written, it was provisionary. Everything in a sense is provisionary. It's not the Bible. In that article you mentioned, there's some quotes from Thomas Jefferson that I didn't realize, but basically saying it's not the Ark of the Covenant. It's a Constitution. It was a very uncomfortable and in some cases immoral compromise that we've inherited, and then we don't have to live with that. And just knowing that other places aren't so stuck. 27 amendments, 10 of them were within a few years right at the start. The last one was about when Congress can get paid, like when their pay raises go into effect after election, and that was actually one of their from back in the day, but not a real amendment since the voting age to 18, like 50 years. It has become untouchable, and that is wrong. And it's I think we're paying the price in the U.S. at least, and the world to some degree, because we can't change it, because we are so scared to do anything differently. And so just the inspiration of saying yes, or the provocation. You've got 316 amendments. What would you do? What a big number. It's not just, let's tweak around the Electoral College. It's like, no, we're gonna have to get into a lot of things on that. So I love that, and maybe everyone can think about that as well. We mentioned imagination. I think that has cascaded and in a sense grown in different, like a weed in different parts of our infrastructure. The structural point of view, rather than a kind of personal, let's elect the right person and we're going to win. I think that was right. I think the idea, it was hot in 2013. I think it cooled. The whole idea of alternate reality game and gaming. I mean, your book was still fresh, Jane, at the time. Still relevant. I think there is a renaissance of that that we might have forgotten, that mindset, which I think is still a really useful thing to think about ourselves as simulators and game designers of a better world, and to play again even that mindset. But anything, and this is kind of open to anybody that wants to jump in, but anything else do you think, I don't know if I want to frame it this way, but I will anyway, that we got right, or that stuck with you, or that like kept resonating over time, or if we could have gone back and sit and talked to us back then, it was like, oh yeah, here's what happened. What was right at the time? What were we thinking that continued to have an impact over the last 10 years?
I have one small thing to say about that, which was at our local convening in Palo Alto, we were invited to go to City Hall and read the preamble to our constitutions that we've been working on. And I remember feeling how elevating that was, to me personally, again, just a game designer at the time, right? To be given a voice in a formal institution. I think that was something the event got right. And, an idea that's becoming increasingly popular, this idea of these citizen assemblies, right? We're sort of randomly selected representative groups, or maybe volunteers, maybe not randomly selected, but people are allowed to come into formal places of governance and speak with each other and speak their mind. And I do think that as we try to create, pathways for imagining how things could be different, we do need to get sort of ordinary citizens into the physical spaces or the physical infrastructure of formal government. I think that's very important because once you're given permission to be in those spaces, it feels like you have permission to change things the way that elected officials change things. So that's something I would say the event got right. And there must be more ways to put people in spaces of power when we ask them to imagine, not just ask them what you would change, but let's put them in a space of power where they maybe feel empowered to do them.
Great. Yeah, I think we think about expanding the zone and spaces of politics out, but it really should think about permeable borders and ecosystems of democracy and where they sit. Sometimes they're in the halls of a city government. Sometimes they're out on the streets. I think we need to be kind of fluid in our minds of where that takes place and be open to both sides.
Yeah.
Steve or Clara, anything?
Yeah, just kind of going off what Jane was saying, I think that one of the things we got right was the importance of spaces and structures for imagination, and how important that is. Both spaces for popular imagination, in which everyday people can sort of reimagine the world that they want to bring into being, but also how to build those into structures. And again, at that time, Clara, you were working in Mexico City, and I hope you can talk a little bit about that, about how do you actually structure that then into government, sort of popular assemblies of imagination. Because I do think that sometimes the danger can be that we can have all these imaginative, great ideas, wonderful ideas, and then government kind of goes on the way it is, or we have them, but it's not about cultivating, facilitating everyday people's imagination and giving that some sort of agency. Not to end on a good note, but a bad one. The one thing I got wrong completely was, I think my book about Dream had come out and they retitled it Dream or Nightmare when the second edition came out, is that because it really was, I could not comprehend at the time the dark side of imagination and the dark side of play and the dark side of sort of alternative reality games like QAnon. It was not on my radar that those things could be mobilized very well by the other side as well, the anti-democratic forces.
That's a great point. And maybe, saying that ARGs and game and serious play kind of have waned. Maybe that's just in our bubble. Maybe it waned because it was being taken up by QAnon. That's dark play. And that has a lot of the similarities of game design and engagement and, fun, honestly fun. It's dark fun, Steve. You write a lot about fun. The QAnon shaman and the costumes and the flags and the boat rallies and all that stuff. There is from my point of view, a kind of a sinister fun that is, and they get something out of it, that's pretty deep. But it has that playful element to it. Clara, anything stood out for you, right or wrong, over the last 10 years?
Sure. So for me, I think that what stayed with me, it was that I think we definitely got right was how complex the world would be then and now. But getting to know or recognizing that complexity and working within it, and how could we harmonize those tensions to create new pathways for democracy was, let's say, like the perspective with which we approach certain issues. And specifically, at that moment, in the laboratory for the city in Mexico City's context, right? So also, I think that something that we also recognize was how resilience helped catalyze new mechanisms for consensus decision making, and what Jane is saying about now the creation of these new mechanisms as assemblies, as other kinds of spaces in which citizens can become more not only active but feel more represented. We're also in that envision that exercise that we did, and in the 6 years before 2013, we as a governmental area try to implement those in several and different ways in which we thought that we can thrive that participation, and maybe channeling it right to maybe approach different communities with different, let's say, gamification was one of those. Crowdsourcing was one of those, and that kind of understanding on how we can better communicate with each of those different communities that were part of that 23 million people that use the city to live in, or maybe to work, and they just to pass it through. So I think that though it were like maybe concepts that we had in mind, but just to make them present and working within them, I think that it helped a lot for a governmental area just to try to work with that and be more adaptive, more responsive as a government, to become more flexible and try to use an iterative approach on how to experiment, to test, to become more, let's say, to learn on those processes and how to better be equipped for what the citizens needed from us. So I think that although it sounds beautiful, the way that you are putting the imagination, the citizens assemblies, and how all this playfulness is needed in the cities, it's a very hard to actually move a governmental structure from how they know how they work to cross those boundaries and let the imagination and new approaches in terms of innovation get within the mechanisms that they know how to work with, right? So it took us a long time. It still, I think, doesn't resonate with how things are being done 6 years after that, and here in the city. But as you said, Jake, previously we managed to maybe provoke and inspire other offices around the world just to maybe put that kind of lens and think about how they can manage to have this within like the set of tools in which they can work within the city and with citizens.
Right.
Can I add like a kind of a resource to that for
Of course.
a group that I think is doing excellent work in trying to really bring that imagination into local governance? It's the group Moral Imagination. It's led by Phoebe Tickle. I'll put a link in the chat, but they're really coming at it from a very local governance. They do imagination training, and they do try to bring, local residents together, but really focus on local officials and what the local community wants to be in the future. So this is sort of small scale, but not at the sort of constitutional level. But their group is really interesting, and they just get into a town and they do try to provide frameworks and processes, and they file reports. So Jerry, thank you for putting the link in chat. I think that's a good group for kind of poking around to see maybe where there's some success happening. And then of course we really want to scale that up to the level of national governance or global governance. Yeah,
I think that's a great point. And I know we knew, and we weren't just thinking about national politics, but we tend to think about constitutions and national politics. But in the 10 years since, the importance of local has kept coming back more and more. I've done a lot of work with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, so working with city leaders and at the city scale, and we've actually ran through this process with them, which was informative to say the least. It was a stretch to get city leaders, elected officials, currently elected officials, mayors, to think about system design rather than sort of tweaking around the problems and challenges of the moment. But a worthy challenge and a worthy goal to do that. But yeah, I think the different scales, and I think I don't know. I think we probably still default to national scale, but I think just the emphasis and the rebalance of where our leverage points are. I know Center for Artistic Activism works on the ground, very local. We're running different things all the time. So yeah, just I think a little bit more nuanced sense of where the intervention points are, the leverage points, and the scale of doing what we might call political system design or social invention, I think has been expanded or at least enhanced for me over the last 10 years. All right, I've got one more prompt for you all, and then I want to queue up the audience for questions, and please just add them to the chat, and I'll try to catch up and look at them and see ones we've missed if I don't see it originally. So just throw them in the chat, please. But okay, all right, it's 2023. you're looking forward, kind of the same mindset, you know, if you could have talked back to, to 2013 to tell them what was going on, you know, what are you telling 2023 now? Like what do we need to be thinking about? What are the kind of issues, challenges, leverage points, ways of approaching things that you would advise current social inventors in 2023, looking ahead, looking forward?
I'll jump in here just because right before this, I was in a meeting with a local organization called Cleveland Votes, which is a grassroots organization working on re-enfranchisement of voters in particularly Black and brown and young voters in Cleveland, Ohio. And about kind of working with local artists and bringing them into the organization, not as people who just create murals, but people who actually help them think about strategies. And what really impressed me about them, and I think maybe a way for the future is kind of following up where discussion has been going, which is how do you operationalize this in very small ways and embed them in systems which are already in operation? In a place like New York, I don't know how you do it in Mexico City, but in a place like New York, it just seems almost impossible. But actually in Cleveland, you can pull it off because there's spaces and places for an opening up, because it's just less of a complex system to run. And so I'm definitely going to check out this Moral Imaginations group, because I really, really am interested for the next 10 years in working in these small ways and like really embedding creatives, artists, structures, facilitating other people's creative in small local systems. Because I think the ripple effect will be great. One of the things that most folks, maybe some folks you probably know, Jake, maybe other people do as well, is the New Deal. The New Deal was tried out in places like New York and Wisconsin way, way before it ever became a national program. A lot of the people, a lot of the programs actually were operational on a local level. And then when FDR got elected, they drew upon those as models for national and could say, that worked or that didn't work. And that might be the stage we're in now, is creating these sort of small successes as proof of concept for why creativity and imagination are so important for thinking about the future in international and global ways.
That's a great point. There's a question from Suzette Masters about state constitutions, which tying these two things together. And we talked about Norway. Go look at state constitutions as well. Those are amended and rewritten quite frequently. And those are laboratories for democracy, as it's been called, right? Even the Articles of Confederation and the colonial constitutions they didn't, you know, the US Constitution didn't come whole cloth from nowhere. There were experiments ongoing. There were lessons that were learned. There were locally appropriate things worked in one place that didn't work in another. But yeah, those kind of experiments and bubbling up those experiments to see what works, what doesn't. If we're going to have amendments, we could sit here, you know, like Athena and try to pop, or Zeus or whatever, and pop them out of our head, and or we can try them out, and not just in localities, but on games, Jane, you know, or in your church or your sports team, or, you know, in your school. I mean, we're already seeing the battlegrounds there. So these local, experiments, and we might see, you know, I think there was a book out called Laboratories of Autocracy, which, you know, in certain places in the US, they're trying out, you know, anti-democratic laws as fast as they can. So, you know, having that freedom and imagination to experiment and pull us to the future rather than everything being a battle to hold on to the last scraps of what we might call democracy. I think we absolutely need that for the future as well. But Jane or Clora, anything from the future or to the future?
I mean, from the future, I would say that our ability to reinvent governance really depends on our ability to move freely, whether it's from city to city, state to state, or nation to nation. I was thinking, like, a lot of my reasons for hope in governance come from the fact that I live in the state of California, where it seems like every year there's some new progressive law enacted, you know, being here when, you know, our mayor of San Francisco just declared we're going to recognize same-sex marriage and you can come and get married. Like we're doing incredible sustainability, carbon, you know, emissions, like you can come to California and be someplace where you like what the government is doing. And in the United States, you have the freedom, maybe not economic security, but there's a freedom to move. It really feels like the ability to move and the economic capacity to move between nations is also very important to motivate change in government and to change in governance, so that there's almost like a more of a marketplace for governance. Where do you want to live? What constitution do you want to live under? There's so much restriction in where we can live now, and we're stuck with the government that we have. You know, looking back from the future, you know, I would like to think I'm looking back from a future where people have more freedom or a human right to relocate or to settle somewhere else so that they can live under a government that respects, you know, their autonomy or their rights or whatever supports their vision of society. And without a marketplace for governance, there's no incentive for innovation. That's kind of a, you know, so for me, you know, I think about more open borders and more migration support economically and legally as kind of key to the social reinvention.
Yeah, I love that. I think that, you know, if we put a big headline on that, mobility and movement, the freedom of movement as a democratic issue. Yes, it's always there, but just highlighting that. You know, yeah, you're in California, I'm in Texas, and we basically have fugitive women acts and vigilantes now. If you're driving across the border or through a town to go to get an abortion out of state, you're basically being stopped and interrogated now. And that sounds, you know, like Handmaid's Tale, but it's happening already. And so, you know, the idea that there is no democracy, there is no freedom without the freedom to move around and go to a different place if you're, you know, unpleased with your government or forced out by climate, obviously. But yeah, thank you for that issue. I think we will be talking about the implications of that dynamic in 2033 and beyond for sure. Clara?
Sure. Maybe my perspective is definitely biased because of what I am working on, but I would say that I have now the chance to work supporting co-creation exercises that civil society organizations and local governments carry out together. So they develop through a collaborative process a set of reforms and policies under, right now, the values of open government, right? And the main purpose is increasing the quality of life in their immediate context and around the globe. So right now, I am responsible of giving support to the Latin American local members of this platform that's called Open Government Partnership. But I think that what most excites me about and might be there also in the future is being an observer of how these processes are. On one side, something completely new in specific contexts, like and bring value to the people in their first approach or in the first time they are co-creating with civil society or maybe citizens, right? Something out of the blue, completely new, and addressing pressing issues, right? But also seeing how this methodology is used over and over. Those outcomes become more ambitious in various aspects. Let's say that maybe with the communities that they work for, and they can positively affect, but also the thematics under those policies that they develop, adding every time some layers of sophistication in each cycle. And by sophistication, quoting sophistication, I mean imagination, I mean other types of concepts that civil servants and regular citizens cannot maybe be close to, but after proving these methodologies of collaboration, they can maybe foresee that might be closer to them by generating a collaborative muscle, right? And in that sense, I think that I would still push forward more and more spaces for bringing creativity in through collaborative processes, and also like starting from that point and let it evolve, because we cannot ask for every single person that lives in the city to get or know how to approach government and how to become more participative if we do not maybe let them experience and experiment a first process. So I think that I am really hoping for this to become more and more like a status quo thing. And we, from where I am working now, although we are furthering it under the values of open government, which are anti-corruption, transparency, access to information, and everything under that. I think that we are also trying for this to become the mechanism to co-create any single policy under any single thematic. So I think that I wish that we could further this more as an example of good governance and the future of governance.
That's great. Yeah, there's so many so many things there in that. I'm glad we have a recording because I want to go back and parse what all of you are saying in detail. So many good nuggets. One thing that stood out to me was the idea of collaborative muscle. And I've done a lot of, democracy workshops and projects and things. And a metaphor that keeps coming up, I think it was our colleague Trig Throngveit who said this with his group originally, was around civic muscle, or maybe democratic muscle. And that metaphor is really powerful because it's active. It's not a thing, that you put up on a wall. It's not a vote that you do once every 4 years. It's really a lifestyle, and it's a mindset and a habit, and I think we don't have the habit because none of our institutions are democratic. Our workplaces, our universities, our sports teams, our churches, they aren't generally run in a democratic way. I mean, maybe some are, but I think we're much more used to kind of hierarchical muscles that we're used to working under, rather than a democratic muscle or a civic muscle in that way. So I'm hoping that maybe we can also think about what our civic gym is to exercise that. Maybe it's a game platform, maybe it's a network that you're working with, maybe it's guerrilla art and activism on the street. But where do you build your civic muscle and exercise that? Couple of questions. Now we're going to go, I'm going to try to pick through some of these. Some of the themes maybe have been talked about. Let's jump in there. So Lauren Zitney says, I've been thinking about culture a lot lately, especially how culture shapes morality. Thinking about scaling government models to large nations and the global community. Can you talk about how you might envision flexibility built in to accommodate such diverse ways of thinking and living? What are your imaginations calling you to consider on that front? I'll throw it open to any of you. You all have an angle on culture from your work, but the idea of culture and morality, and then building systems to accommodate or enliven diverse cultures.
I'm going to just jump in with really kind of obvious things, which is, culture is absolutely essential. If you can't change the culture, then you will have no resiliency with any policies or platforms or structures you build. How politics works is it becomes common sense, of course.
Right.
And that in a lot of ways is the battle right now about what are the of course. What I worry a little bit about is a disjuncture between a relatively liberal culture, left liberal culture, and a reactionary political system, because I think that somehow we're able to keep those in play simultaneously. And so again, it goes back to what we've been talking about before. How do you actually move these imaginative experiments, these sort of opening ups of culture, and implement them in structures that have real power? And I wish I knew how to do that. I don't, but I think that is one of the problems we need to be grappling with.
But these are kind of mutually entailing forces. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Like you can try to hammer laws onto people's heads if they don't agree and the culture is not there. That's going to be difficult. But look at the scenario around gay marriage. And yeah, there was a cultural base there, but once it became legal, it was kind of amazing how fast culture responded to that. So,
Well, okay, that's a great example though, because for one of the things that happened early on, say in Maine, is that gay marriage was approved by the governor as a law, and then it got overturned because they hadn't done the cultural work.
Right.
And so the marriage equality folks did this sort of deep canvassing, which was going door to door, talking to people about what their life was like and their relationships were like. When it came up again to be voted on, it actually won because they had done that cultural work.
Right. Yeah, good point. Same in Hawaii too, that it was one of the early states to make it, and then there was a backlash, immediate backlash. So yeah, there's a phrase we have, it takes 20 years to be an overnight sensation. So but it's complicated, right? I mean, culture and structure, or culture and law, or culture and government are not like the only catalyst. They are in a dance together, and sometimes that dance is very complicated, and sometimes, again, you don't know where the real leverage point might be, or when that trigger might happen. Also, I just want to make it, there's some comments in the chat that I wanted to bring to the floor as well about freedom of movement. We talked about that, but also what about the right to stay put? And what about the right to not be oppressed if you're in, yeah, we want to move out of an oppressive situation, but shouldn't you be able to stay at home and not be oppressed too? Or I would love to stay put, but climate, I'm flooded out of my house, so that dynamic just was mentioned, and I want to bring that up as well. Let's see. I'm looking here. Anyone can answer or talk about anything that's been discussed here while I'm looking for. Well, how about this one? This is a little bit more pointed, issue-based. Where do you begin to redress political corruption? Check out this is from Rick Botello. Check out the American Promises constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United and get dark money out of politics. So, all right, very structural. Maybe it's amendment based, but how do we deal with corruption? And how are you thinking about that?
That's not my wheelhouse, so I'm strategically silent on that.
Oddly, it is my wheelhouse. So I just came off a 3-year project in West Africa and the Western Balkans, working with activists from about 8 different countries around corruption, right? And how asking this question, which is, what do you do about systemic corruption? And they actually really did convince me that the way to do it best, because many of these countries have official offices on corruption, it's written into their constitution, yet corruption has become such a part of natural culture that they really said that what we really need to do is to root it out. And so they came up with these really imaginative sort of performances, plays, interventions, which would get people to denaturalize corruption and become something. No, of course we wouldn't do that. Why would anybody do that? That's unpatriotic. So they saw it, and I'm going to trust them, as culture needed to lead and become a practice of non-corruption that would start out in play, but then would later become institutionalized in everyday governmental practice and private practice. Mm-hmm. And now I'm going to be quiet.
Great, thank you. Let's see. All right, here's one again from Rick Botello, but one that is near and dear to my heart. How might we orchestrate a diversity of metaphors to collaborate on our solving our complex web of self-inflicted wicked problems in the 21st century? So maybe this will be our last one. I mentioned civic muscle. I love a good metaphor or myth to base it on. So if you're thinking about social invention and democracy for the future, what myth or metaphor would you build it on? What resonates with you?
I don't know if this is exactly a myth or metaphor, but I've been thinking a lot about the types of people who are called to lead or serve in different types of governments or organizations. And there was a really, I think, radical for the New York Times op-ed by Adam Grant, the Wharton business psychologist professor, saying that because when you do analysis of elected leaders, they tend to be very strongly overrepresented on the dark triad of like psychological traits, so like narcissism, sociopathy, lack of empathy or compassion. That he was saying we shouldn't even have elected officials anymore, because the way that the power structures and the experience of power in our type of elected government, it just draws people who aren't psychologically fit to serve the public. And so I feel like there's a need for some new kind of myth or or culture around elected officials that is totally separated from power.
Mm.
Because, and Adam Grant's suggestion was we do sortition, you like get elected once, it's random, it's a lottery, and then you never serve again in that capacity, which is a different model. But yeah, there's something about separating power so that we can have leadership that is not so overrepresented on traits of sociopathy and narcissism.
Yeah, we have, our public service and, kind of your mission to serve and all of that, sort of in there, but it kind of, we've lost it. You don't hear that very much, like my civic duty. You're answering the corruption question too, Jane, in a different way too, I mean, why do people get into politics? It's to hoard power and make more money, maybe,
Yeah. If you could take the power and ability to make money out of it, so that you have no power and you can't profit off of your status in that way, that would go a long way.
Either you're completely anonymous or completely transparent. Maybe those are the two things.
Completely
Everything has to be one.
anonymous. I mean, that's great. Like if we wanted to have a really wild scenario, all elected officials are anonymous.
Mm-hmm.
What a great way to start.
Yeah, I have to I like the extremes. Either you're completely transparent and we watch you like the Truman Show, every email you send, every person you talk to, or you're completely anonymous. Maybe those are the choices.
Okay, so like Dave Eggers' The Circle, if you get elected, then you have to commit to wearing one of those new AI things that are recording every conversation and there are new signals of change that make this seem more technologically viable, at least.
Might be some different personality faults that attracts. But all right, Clora, Steve, your metaphor you would build a future world on.
I don't know. I don't have an example in mind, but I think that creating several kind of muscles in a different way. I think that must help us address the issues that are in place, but also I don't know. I am very positive of exercising in that sense, like constantly and letting I forgot the word. Letting the knowledge of those exercises just rise, and at some point we will tackle the actual problem solution. I don't know, maybe something like that around that.
Yeah.
And just to make a point on anti-corruption, or how to tackle corruption, I would say that I've been sense of an observer of how different cities or different localities around the world are really trying to fight corruption. And I think that where it all begins is with willingness. And in that sense, it doesn't have to be the high level politician that might address this issue, but also coming from a civil servant or civil society, or even a citizen. You can push forward, starting to tackle their very wider examples of how people are really creating case studies around this. And it doesn't have to take not even an enormous amount of money, but it takes willingness. So you have to convince, and maybe there's also a muscle of how to convince everyone.
Thank you. Yes, nothing will draw people to democracy more than telling them it's like a workout. No, maybe we'll try to make it fun too. Steve, the last word.
Exactly.
You got a metaphor?
I love this idea of muscle memory, and I just keep thinking Augusto Boal talking about this sort of theater practice and his theater games as rehearsals for the revolution, which make it a little bit more fun than going to the gym. But I think that's what we need, is rehearsals for this new future.
Wonderful. Great to leave it on. Aisha put a link in the chat, I think, with our next webinar on November 16th. And we're going to go because we're at time, but I'm so much more to say. I'm so stimulated, energized by what you all have said. I'm so thankful that you were there 10 years ago. I'm so thankful that you're here now in the present. And maybe we'll talk to each other in 2033, see what the world's like then. But have a great day, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Thanks so much for inviting.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for coming.